Welcome to the Market Failures set of podcasts. There are 5 podcasts all devoted to market failures. The previous podcast was on the topic of using regulations to protect against market failures. This podcast is the 4th in the series and covers the topic of providing goods and services as a way to correct market failures. The next podcast in the series, the 5th out of 5, discusses stabilizing the economy. Now let's begin to learn about how and why the government sometimes provides goods and services in order to avoid and correct problems that would occur if left to the market. Modern technology has allowed for a higher standard of living. It is often easy to access goods and services, so easy that it has become an expectation that we can easily get the highest quality products from anywhere in a matter of days, if not hours. While the competitive market gives us an incentive for private businesses to continue to innovate, it is still impossible for private businesses to provide everything to everyone. Sometimes it's because businesses have no motivation to create certain goods or services that are not profitable or easy to produce. This can not only put a burden on consumers who expect reliable, fast service, but can also limit access to the poor and/or people who live in certain areas. The reasons for supplying public goods and services can be broken down into 4 broad. Let's begin with profitability. Some goods and services must be provided for the good of society. However, there is no private business willing to provide them. This is because they don't make companies enough money due to location or lots of regulations. Society as a whole would be worse off if certain things didn't exist, and thus the government must step in. An example is healthcare. There are some areas where many private hospitals exist, but running a hospital and attracting qualified employees is quite difficult. If there were no public hospitals, few would exist in rural or poor areas. In reality, even with public hospitals, there is still a shortage of them in rural areas because it's hard to attract doctors, even when the government does have programs offering financial incentives to get people to work there. Another example is the Postal Service. Think about what would happen if the Postal Service was completely privately run. A major problem would be that due to a lack of incentive for businesses, they would not set up post offices in rural areas because it wouldn't be profitable for them. Thus, certain people wouldn't be able to send or receive mail. While the Postal Service is owned by the government, there is still an element of the market system in how it's run, since it is actually run separately with mostly separate funds from the rest of the government. This means the Postal Service sets its own prices, including postage prices, as not to lose money. The difference is that it is not nearly as concerned with turning a profit. However, shipping prices are fairly similar to private shipping companies, such as UPS and FedEx. Public hospitals, similarly, are run more like private businesses that set up their own prices and wages, relying on the market in order to do so. Next, sometimes things are not safe when left to the market. Sometimes the government has to control things that could have a very negative impact on the population if in private hands. Think what would happen if the military was completely privatized. The decisions it made might not be in the best interest of the country. Similarly, if private industry controlled the production of nuclear weapons, there would not be nearly as much oversight as there is now, and it would be easy for devices of mass destruction to get into the wrong hands. This is not to say that the government does everything internally when it comes to weapons in the military. A lot of the time it uses private contractors to help build military equipment. However, because the government is the one contracting with these private companies, it can provide a lot of oversight, meaning it gets to pick the companies and approve what it does at many steps along the way. Next, efficiency is one important reason for creating a market economic system. The market allows people to use resources in the best way possible to produce their desired results. It also allows businesses to produce the goods and services that people want, that will most benefit them. At least that is how it works in theory. However, reality is different from theory. It's sometimes difficult to believe that the government can run something more efficiently and effectively than the private sector can, but that is sometimes the case. Think about what would happen if things like electricity and water companies were completely private and left to market forces. we would probably end up with power lines and water lines all over the place, way more than we actually need. While utilities companies are sometimes privately run, they are often still highly regulated by the government and/or indirectly run by them. Historically, we have experienced the negative effects of having certain industries remain in private hands. It's not always been super efficient. For example, this is a map from 1890 of the country's railroad lines. Notice how many lines existed. Companies would build their own railways and tracks. They built so many of them that there were too many. Tracks were difficult to maintain and became abandoned when companies went out of business. Lines went to and from the same or similar destinations, using land and resources that could have been used for something else. It was not efficient. Similarly, when New York City's subways were first built at the turn of the 20th century, the lines were built by competing companies who built many subway stations using tracks of varying widths so that trains could not run on more than one line. This meant that when a company went out of business, the trains could not be used on other lines, and the former stations sat abandoned. Also, some areas of New York City had multiple subway lines, and others were left far from the subways. This was not only inefficient, but it also led to economic loss, so much so that the city eventually created a government-owned company to run the transportation system. Lastly, there is the issue of equity. As we know, there are winners and losers in the market, and that's not always fair. Now, it's true, as it's also true with safety nets, that what is considered equitable or fair for some might not be to others, and vice versa. So the extent that the government should provide certain goods and services to people as a public benefit is something often debated. For example, not everyone is going to agree whether or not the government should provide health care to those who can't afford it. However, people who don't have health care and/or wouldn't be able to have it without government help still get sick and tend to be unhealthier on average. This creates negative externalities for society as a whole, as the uninsured tend to use emergency rooms at high rates and then not have the money to pay the hospital bills. This financially hurts both private and public hospitals, since patients cannot be turned away from the ER. Many societies do have some form of health insurance for the poor, and not necessarily because it helps those who benefit directly from the programs, but because others, such as hospitals and those employed by them, benefit indirectly. Regardless, this is only one example and not meant to advocate for or against specific healthcare policies. This is because public education is good for society overall. An educated population is a wealthier, more stable one. Countries with poor and underdeveloped educational systems tend to be less stable and less democratic. Through education, people also gain skills that make them more productive. Also, education spurs economic growth, because the more educated a person is, the more money he or she makes on average, which leads to economic growth. Lastly, lack of education and poverty go hand in hand. The worse educated a population is, the more of a burden those people will be on society as a whole, given that the uneducated use more government-sponsored safety nets. As people gain better educations, they tend to spend less time using those government-supplied resources. Thus, education for all can benefit everyone. There is, of course, plenty of room for debate on how the public education system should be run. Should it be run more similarly to a private business such as the Postal Service and utility companies? Or should it be run in a more traditional manner? Regardless of how you think schools should be run, the government is still the one funding and providing most of them. To conclude, public goods and services are to a certain extent needed in society. There is considerable debate around how many should be provided and how programs to distribute them should be run. But in general, the market simply can't provide everything a stable modern society needs. These reasons can be broken down into 4 areas: non-profitability, not safe in private hands, not efficient in the market, and not equitable in the market. Because the government has responded to these types of market failures through providing goods and services, the population as a whole is better off. Continue to the 5th podcast in the series to learn about the government's role in stabilizing the economy so that it can protect against market failures.